Um, Thanks for the introduction, Greg. You're right. The Tales from the Gulp is the first set of novellas set in the town of Culpeper, who locals call it the Gulp because the place has a habit of swallowing people. And there's a follow-up collection of five more novellas called The Fall. Uh, all the stories take place in or around Culpeper and sort of slowly expand on the lore and history and everything else of that town. There will at some point be more Gulp stories. There's the first one, the first short story set in the Gulp outside of those two books was written for an anthology that currently is now on hiatus. I'm not sure what's happening with that now after I got commissioned to write a story. So we'll see. But I'll definitely write more in that world. That was half the point of the start of that, and I'll talk a little bit about how that came to be because the birth of it in some ways is relevant to the way that it was built. I know that I'm talking a bit about general sort of world building and to a more direct point, small town horror and more focused horror and stuff like that. So I'll try to stay a little bit on topic, but I am also a notorious digressor. So I'll think of something and suddenly I'll be talking about, I don't know, cats in ancient Egypt or something that is got vague relevance to what I was talking about before. So pull me back if you need to. Um, I think one of the most important things in the first instance is to understand the idea of what horror is. And so often we'll be at conventions or we'll be at workshops or on panels or whatever, and you've got a particular subject that you're supposed to be talking about, and you spend the entire hour trying to define horror. It's a constant nightmare in that respect, if you'll pardon the pun. It The idea of what horror is important to understand how you write horror, obviously, but it's also important to understand what horror isn't. Um, and in some ways, that's easier. Horror and comedy both are more like a spice that can be added to any other recipe. They are a genre in themselves. You can have something that's written to be horror or something that's written to be comedy. But equally, you can have a thriller, science fiction, fantasy, romance, any of those things. And you can add horror or comedy to those to varying degrees, however much you want to. The more you add, the more it moves away from its base genre and becomes more horror or comedy. But regardless, those things are there to be sort of manipulated, if you like. And I think it's important to remember that when you're working with horror, especially when you're building with horror, because if you try too hard to build something that's horror, you end up heading off into that sort of Hammer House of Horror B movie schlock kind of vibe because you're playing into the horror tropes, which is great. There's a place for that, but it's not necessarily what you want to be writing. Whereas if you remember that you're writing a story to which you are adding horror and you remember to focus on the story, then you will develop a better idea of what it is that you're trying to do. The purpose of horror is not, in essence, to scare people, and this is something that um, a lot of people sort of stumble around this division, this defining line. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, I read horror because I want to be scared." It's, well, that's true, but that's a sort of an umbrella term that it's very difficult to actually be scared. Like you can be sitting in your lounge room reading a book and enjoying a good story, and while the story might be disturbing, you might feel perturbed. You are not actually scared. You are using the story to elicit emotion. And one of the most likely emotions you're not going to elicit is actual fear because you're safe. You know that. That's the purpose. In the same reason we watch horror movies, the same reason we read horror books is to experience this stuff in safety. Um, but the idea of horror is to generate those emotions, to lift those emotions, dread, despair, disquiet, the nature of dis-ease, not disease, but to be uneasy. And we can explore that through the story. We can explore those emotions through the characters and everything else. And the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the the word horror itself, its purpose is to create fear, dread, whatever, right up to terror. We can talk about the difference of that in a second too. But the word horror comes from auror, O-R-R-O-R, which is Old French, and it means to shudder or to bristle, which is like horripilation is when you're when the hairs stand up on your arms, the back of your neck, that sensation of whoa, and the hairs stand up, that's called horripilation, and that comes from the old French aurore. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind because anything you write is going to be so much more effective if you are focused on a story and you're spicing it to trigger that little bit of horripilation rather than trying to actively write something scary. As I said, I'll digress and randomly a bit, but I think it's an important sort of it's an important distinction to make because you are very unlikely to scare people. And the people you are least likely to scare are horror readers because we read this stuff all the time. So we're not likely. If something really gets under our skin, that's a really great book. That's what we love. That's what we're looking for all the time. We're looking for that book that really does perturb us, the one that's really getting deep under the skin, really getting um, it's creating all those emotions in us, and we at the same time can't put it down but don't want to read on. And those books, the more horror you read, those books get rarer and rarer because you become not exactly inured to it, but you get so used to things that you come to expect things. And when you come to expect things, you're less likely to be surprised by them. So I think it's important to understand that this is a principle in horror. And if you're writing horror, it's a very important thing to bear in mind because you want to be trying to create the right thing. You don't want to be trying to create something that doesn't work. As a slight digression, as Greg mentioned, I'm a martial artist. My day job for many, many years has been teaching martial arts. And one of the workshops I run talks about writing fight scenes and writing effective fight scenes. Because when we're writing and we've got all the five senses and we can be inside the person's mind and everything like that, we can write really powerful and evocative fight scenes. The thing we don't want to do is basically transcribe a movie fight. Most people have never had a fight, which is a good thing. But obviously, the whole write what you know thing means that it can be difficult to write a fight if you don't know what it's like to fight. So most people's experience of fighting is watching the movies. So they go, okay, that was a really exciting fight in that film. I'm basically going to sort of do that in my book. And if you do that, you're taking one form of media which is two-dimensional and turn-based because the camera has to focus on what's happening and you have to view it from the outside. And you're transcribing that into something that is multiple focused and immediate and internal, which means that the fight scene that you write is not going to be very good. The same thing applies if you're writing horror. If you try to write a book that emulates a horror movie, you're going to miss all the key parts that make a horror movie. It's very difficult to write a jump scare. It can be done. One of the famous ones is people who've read Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. There's that moment where the two girls are Nell and it's been a long time since I've read it now, but the two girls they're scared in the room and Nell's holding the other girl's hand and they're all scared. They don't know what's going on. Then she realizes that the other girl's actually across the other side of the room and she's, well, whose hand was I holding then? And it has, and when you're reading that in the book, it has this moment of, oh, and it's almost the equivalent of a jump scare, but it takes someone of Shirley Jackson's caliber to pull off something like that. So you don't want to try to write and world build in horror in a book the same way you would in a film, because in a film, jump scares, music score, all that stuff sets so much of the atmosphere. If you want to make a horror film not scary, turn the volume off. If you mute the sound and just watch it, it just looks like ridiculous pantomime. You add the music and all of a sudden it's terrifying. And so we need to recognize those things when we're building world building in our stories, in our books. So when we're doing that, we have to understand what it is in the writing of things that makes for effective world building. So if we jump back to the gulp as an example, back in, God, what even is time recently over the last few years, basically pre-pandemic, somebody on Twitter started talking about this article about a kangaroo that was terrorizing this Northern Territory town and ripping up gardens and kind of attacking people. Everybody thought it was a joke and it was like the equivalent of The Onion or something in Australia. And those of us who are Australians on the page, no, that's true. That happens sometimes. You know, kangaroos are bastards. They can be really annoying. And so this whole thing came up about how funny it was. And then Keelan Patrick Burke, who's a great writer, Irish-American guy, he's a brilliant horror writer, and you should absolutely check out his stuff if you don't know it. He's also an amazing cover designer. And so just for fun, he mocked up an old Zebra horror cover, you know, the old boom of horror, that Zebra and the Dorchester and all that stuff. He mocked up a Zebra horror cover of The Roo as a horror novel, um, because we were just having fun with it. And then everybody said that it would be a crime to waste that cover. Somebody should write the book. Unfortunately, I was the token Australian in that particular conversation. Everybody started hassling me to write the book. And I even started getting some DMs and people going, seriously, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. So, and I had no intention of it. And within a couple of days, it became quite apparent that people were genuinely expecting this book. At the time, I'd had an idea about a story I wanted to write, which I thought was going to be a short story or maybe a novelette that was basically addressing the ideas of isolation and domestic violence and stuff like that in outback Australia, set against a backdrop of a monster, because obviously in horror we often use a monster to hide what we're really talking about. And it occurred to me, actually, you know what? I could write that story and the monster could be a killer kangaroo. So then I decided to write it as the most Ozploitation, sort of B movie, classic horror, everything I just told you you're not really supposed to do, as in to emulate a film. But I decided to write the book version of that. And so I got in contact with Keelan and I was like, so everybody's bugging the shit out of me. Can I have that cover after all? And we talked about that, and he's like, well, you're not having that one. It's not good enough. And so he made it better. So the book got written. It's called The Root. And it's the most deliberately gonzo, crazy, sort of outback horror story you can find. And the idea behind it really was every time the Roo kills someone, it gets more and more sort of outrageous and ridiculous to the point. Well, I won't say to the point. If you want to read it, you'll have fun with it. It's deliberately gonzo and bonkers. And it was written as a bit of a joke. And I self-published it because I was like, I'm not even going to bother trying to approach publishers with this. That just, they're going to get laughed out of town. And it was really popular. If all my books sold as well as the Roo, I'd be very happy. But then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden, everything was changing. I was having to pivot my Kung Fu school to this, on doing it like this with Zoom online, which took massive amounts of brain space. All of a sudden, we were homeschooling our daughter because school was closed, and everything changed. And so writing just got smashed because suddenly we had all these different things to deal with, along with the early days of the pandemic itself. And the projects that I was working on, or the one particular project that I was working on, was a fairly big and complex novel. And with all this other stuff going on, I did not have the headspace to focus on it. So I was like, I'm just going to shelve that for a few months until we're on top of this stuff. Which led me to go, well, I can't not write because I just get antsy when I do that. And I've got a bit of time here, a bit of time there. I have to still do this thing. And for a long time, here's me finally getting to the point. For a long time, I'd had this idea that I wanted to do an Australian equivalent of like King's Castle Rock or something like that. So much of my horror, particularly in short stories, less so with the novels, although a lot more so now, was set in Australia. And I wanted to avoid that thing where I was always setting work in the US or in the UK or something like that because the market demands. Because the Roo, the reason I talked about that, the one thing the Roo had proven to me was that there was a massive market all around the world for incredibly Australian stories. Like I couldn't write a more Australian story than the Roo if I tried. It's like it's got a stronger accent than Steve Irwin, that book. So I was aware of the fact that people would be open to it. And that made me think, well, then maybe I can do this thing that I was planning and never got round to because I didn't think it would pay off. And I can create my Australian Castle Rock or equivalent. So, in the gaps between all the craziness of the early days of the pandemic, I started jotting down some notes and thinking about options of how it would go. And the beats that I wanted to hit to really get the most out of the horror that I could build with these stories, because the idea was that it was somewhere I could come back and revisit frequently. It was a fictional geography that I could use again and again in different stories, often entirely standalone stories, often with Easter eggs for people who've read more of my work, because I like to think that my readers are as much a nerd as I am. And if they're reading a story and they go, oh, that's so and so from that story, and they suddenly get really excited because they recognize someone who's just walking down the street and is irrelevant. It's good stuff, right? It gives you a buzz when you get that stuff. And so I was like, I want to build this universe. So I live in Tasmania now, but at the time I lived on the south coast of New South Wales. And I wanted to hit certain beats that I could really draw on for the horror in the terms of the world building that I was doing. And the three key things that I wanted was, one was isolation, because there's nothing quite like Australia for isolation in terms of size. Like the continent is the size of the of North America, and it's got a population of 25 million people or less. 90% of the population live on 10% of the landmass right around the edge of the country. The middle of the country is just mostly desert. And the town of Morgan Creek in the Roo was very much deliberately an outback town, out in the desert, middle of nowhere. And I was exploring themes of isolation and all the subsequent social problems that come from that with that story. So I wanted the isolation because the size of Australia and the distance between things in Australia and the potential for social isolation is enormous compared to a lot of other places. But I didn't want to be back in the outback because I also wanted to be by the sea. This was another of the key beats I wanted with this world building. I wanted it to be a harbour town with a lighthouse because I've just got weird nerdy obsessions with things like that. But also in terms of, I mentioned King's Castle Rock, there's also Lovecraft's Innsmouth. And that whole balance between the land and the sea and the vast unknown of the cosmic universe is reflected in the vast unknown of the ocean. We know so little about the ocean and what's down there. We know so little about what might be down there. The more we explore, the more weird stuff we discover. And that is ripe for drawing on in terms of horror. And I wanted a town that had an unrecognized potentially, but some unusual history that I could slowly tease out through the course of the stories that I wanted to write. So I came up with the idea of Goldpepper. So I lived on the south coast near a town called Kiama, Kiama. Kiama is about 2 hours south of Sydney, and that's the nearest sort of harbour town to where I lived. That's where my school was. My Kung Fu Academy was in Kiama before I moved down here to Tasmania and stuff. So while Goldpepper is definitely not Kiama, if you got a map of Kiama and laid it over a map of Goldpepper, it would line up quite well. Because, why reinvent the wheel in terms of literal geography? But I took that idea and I moved it a couple of hours more down the coast so that it was further from everything. And I made it a place that was completely surrounded by bush. And the first sort of bit of world building, if you like, the first idea that this place is not a great place necessarily to be, is the idea there's a town north of Goldpepper called Endon, and there's a town south of Goldpepper called Moncton. And there's a road that runs from Endon to Moncton. It's a highway. Most people take it. But just after you leave Endon, there's a fork in the road. Most maps don't even show it. As you're driving along, you just see a fork and it says Goldpepper. And if you weren't really paying attention, it's easy to ignore. If you were just looking at it on the map, you wouldn't notice it. But if you decided to take that fork, then you're in for some more interesting times than if you just drove straight through to Moncton. Halfway down that road, there's a left turn. It says Goldpepper that way. You got another chance not to go there. You could just keep going because that road runs sort of kind of parallel to the other road. They both go between Endon and Moncton. This one just goes straight on. This one has the left turn. So first you take the left fork, and then you take the left turn, and then you've only got yourself to blame because you had two chances not to go to Goldpepper, but you still went anyway. So this is the first kind of drawing people away from the safety of normality, however normal anything in Australia is. And all this driving is happening through bushland. There's sort of this temperate bush that is through most of the south of New South Wales, lots of gum trees and fern trees. It's beautiful stuff. And as you turn that, if you take that second left turn and you start heading towards the coast and towards Goldpepper, first of all, you come across a couple of farms and you come over a rise and you see laid out before you this bowl, this geographical natural bowl that is got bush on both sides, north and south, only the one road leading in and out. I can't make it any more plain that you shouldn't be there. If you do keep going in, then you come over the hill and you come down into the town of Culpeper. And here's where it, in terms of world building, this is important, is that when you come over that hill and you drop down into Culpeper, there's a big Woolworths supermarket, there's shops, there's cafes, there's a roundabout, there's a war memorial. It's an entirely normal town. It's exactly what you'd expect from an Australian country town, because the best horror is hidden in the absolute mundane. It's hidden in something that seems entirely normal, because the best horror is when you take what is basically normal and safe and you just corrupt it a little bit. You just shift it slightly off, out of focus. And in the first instance, you just shift it a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, until eventually you've got truly weird stuff going on. I've just noticed that Cameron's screen's gone all red and tentacly, which is ironic as we've just entered the gulp. Does that mean I'm out of time? I'll carry on. I'm nearly there anyway. The point being that...
Please, go ahead.
Sure. So the point being that this was something that was created to give plenty of warning that was going on if people wanted to pay attention to it. But when you get there, it's otherwise entirely normal. Most people live their lives. A lot of people live in Culpeper and they go to Endon or Moncton or further afield for work and they come back. But everybody knows that stuff's a bit weird in Culpeper. Everybody knows that weird stuff happens. Everybody knows that most people don't leave Culpeper. Most people don't want to because they know there's no point. For a lot of people, they know they do want to and they try, but they still don't get away. Other people come into Culpeper because they know it's rich pickings for weirdness. Other people come in because they think it will be fun and realize they've made a terrible mistake and then they can't get out again. And through the course of the stories in these books, I was going to say a lot, which is probably not fair. I was going to say a lot of why is explained. Maybe not a lot of why is explained, but some is explained. Certainly a lot more in the fall as you get through the second set of 5 novellas. And you get to learn a little bit more about why Culpeper is like it is. But that's the other side of the world building, is that even though I've given a lot of hints and reasons for certain aspects of it, the big picture is still not explained. Culpeper's freaking weird. Culpeper's always going to be freaking weird. And despite the big climactic event at the end of the fall, which kind of shuts things down from this sort of apocalyptic peak that they were reaching towards, Culpeper's still weird. And it's still going to be that way. And I'll still get to revisit it and write more stories. I've got a novel coming out next month called Blood Covenant, which is set up the mountains west of Culpeper. And it's got absolutely no relation to the stories of the Gulp, other than the nerds who have read the Gulp and enjoyed it will go, oh, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so. And so I plan to carry on doing all those sorts of things. And so I've taken basically a pretty normal Australian harbour town that, other than being strangely isolated, is otherwise like any other strange town, or otherwise like any other country town, all of which are strange, and just basically started turning up the weirdness, the residents, the buildings, the events, the culture, even the diet in some small aspects of the people around this particular town. Every little bit of it is just tweaked a little bit beyond normal, a little bit beyond what people would expect. And every time people think they're getting an idea of Culpeper, something else comes along and corrupts that idea again. And this slow process of repeated corruption is how I build the weirdness of the Gulp. And hopefully it works, and hopefully it will continue to work, because I want to make more stories there